The ferry groaned, a tired beast pushing through the slate-gray swells. Dean stood on the exposed deck, the salt spray whipping his face raw, tasting of brine and something else, something metallic and ancient, like the ship's rusted hull. He clutched the worn strap of his duffel bag, his knuckles white. The island had been a smudge on the horizon for an hour, a low, dark hump swallowed and regurgitated by the fog. Now, it loomed, a jagged profile of rock and stunted pines, crowned by the stoic sentinel of the lighthouse. His cartographer's eye, usually so precise, felt blurred, dulled by a grief that had settled deep in his bones, heavier than any ocean chart. He'd come here for solitude, for the raw, abrasive comfort of isolation. A fresh start, they'd said, the solicitor's voice a thin, reedy thing against the roar of his own despair. He'd inherited the lighthouse keeper's cottage from his grandfather, a man he barely remembered, a man whose life had been as distant and enigmatic as this very island. The ferry shuddered, grinding against the barnacle-encrusted pilings of the small, derelict dock. A single lamp, caged in wire, cast a weak yellow glow into the encroaching twilight. No one waited. No one greeted him. Just the chill wind and the ceaseless shriek of gulls, their calls sounding less like birds and more like lost, wailing souls. He was the only passenger to disembark. The ferryman, a burly figure with a face like weathered leather, merely grunted, hauling Dean's heavy trunk onto the damp planks. Mind the tide, he rasped, then turned, the ferry's engine rumbling to life, pulling away from the island as if eager to escape. Dean stood alone on the dock, the trunk at his feet, the duffel slung over his shoulder. The air was thick with the scent of decaying seaweed and damp earth. He consulted the crude map the solicitor had provided, a hand-drawn sketch that looked more like a child's treasure hunt than a navigational aid. The cottage was a mile inland, nestled below the lighthouse's beam. The path was overgrown, choked with thorny bushes and slick with recent rain. He dragged the trunk, the wheels protesting with a high-pitched whine that grated on his nerves. The fog, which had momentarily receded, began to creep back in, tendrils unfurling from the higher elevations, swallowing the sparse trees, then the rocky outcrops, until the world shrank to a damp, gray tunnel around him. He felt an inexplicable pressure in his ears, a faint ringing that seemed to emanate from the very air itself. After what felt like an eternity, the path opened onto a small, desolate clearing. And there it was, the cottage. It was smaller than he'd imagined, a squat, stone structure with a slate roof, its windows like vacant eyes staring out at the churning sea. The paint on the window frames was peeling, the wood beneath bleached and splintered. A riot of weeds choked the front porch, obscuring what might once have been a small garden. A rusted weather vane, shaped like a forgotten sea creature, creaked mournfully atop a crooked pole. He pushed open the warped front door. It groaned in protest, a long, drawn-out sigh. Moonlight, weak and watery, filtered through the grimy windows, illuminating motes of dust dancing in the heavy air. The living room was sparse. A threadbare armchair, a heavy wooden table, and a bookshelf filled with books whose spines had faded into illegibility. His grandfather's life, reduced to these few, decaying artifacts. He walked through the small cottage, each step raising a puff of dust. The bedroom contained a narrow cot, a chest of drawers, and a single, cracked mirror reflecting the gloom. As he moved, he became aware of a subtle sound, almost imperceptible at first. A faint, rhythmic thump-thump-thump, like a slow, heavy pulse. He paused, straining his ears. It seemed to come from beneath the floorboards, a vibration more than a sound. Nothing. Only the wind whistling through a loose pane, or perhaps the distant thrum of the lighthouse generator. He chastised himself. Grief was playing tricks on his senses. He decided to explore the perimeter, to get a lay of the land before the fog swallowed everything entirely. Outside, behind the cottage, nestled into the sloping earth, he noticed a squat, moss-covered mound. It wasn't natural. A slab of weathered granite, half hidden by brambles, formed a low archway. A rusted iron door, almost swallowed by the earth, was set into the stone. His cartographer's curiosity, dormant for so long, stirred. This wasn't on the solicitor's map. A faint, metallic smell, sharper than the sea air, emanated from within. The door was heavy, resisting his initial push, but then, with a deep groan of tortured hinges, it swung inward a few inches. He peered into the gloom. A set of rough-hewn stone steps descended into absolute blackness. The air down there felt different, heavier, pressing in. This was no root cellar. This was an underground bunker. He reached for the flashlight in his duffel bag, his heart beginning to beat with a slow, insistent rhythm against his ribs. He hesitated, a prickle of unease crawling up his spine. But the determination that had driven him to this desolate island, the desperate need for answers, for anything to break the monotony of his sorrow, propelled him forward. The ferry's engines died with a final, shuddering sigh, leaving Dean adrift in a sudden, vast silence. The gangplank clanged down, metal on rock, a stark punctuation mark in the oppressive quiet. The cottage, a squat, gray sentinel, hunkered on a distant rise, its windows like vacant eyes staring out at the churning slate-gray sea. The first days were a blur of unpacking and attempting to impose order on the dusty, disused rooms. He craved the solitude, he told himself, the quiet balm for his grief. Yet, the quiet here was not peaceful, it was a hungry, expectant thing, listening. He began his own cartographic survey, tracing the jagged coastline, noting the crags and hidden coves. It was then he first noticed the tides. They behaved erratically. One morning, the water receded further than any chart indicated, exposing a vast expanse of glistening, slick rock that should have remained submerged. He rationalized it as an unusual spring tide, a quirk of the island's unique geology, perhaps amplified by the recent storms. He even took detailed measurements, convinced he could find a scientific explanation, a comfort in the numbers. At first, he dismissed them as the wind, a mournful lament whistling through the cottage's drafty eaves. Or perhaps the roar of the sea, distorted by distance and the island's peculiar acoustics. But as the days bled into one another, the sound grew more distinct, less like natural phenomena and more like fragmented voices, a low, guttural murmur carried on the fog. He'd pause, pencil hovering over a half-drawn contour line, straining to decipher the unintelligible sounds. His determined grip on logic was a lifeline. One afternoon, driven by a cartographer's insatiable curiosity and a growing restlessness, Dean decided to explore the island's interior. He traversed a winding, overgrown path, pushing through thorny gorse and tenacious ferns, until he stumbled upon a low, moss-covered mound hidden beneath a cluster of stunted pines. A heavy, rusted metal hatch, almost entirely consumed by rust and roots, was set into the earth. It was clearly man-made, and clearly old. His grandfather, the old recluse, had built more than just a cottage. With a grunt of effort, Dean managed to pry the hatch open. A gust of damp, earthy air, thick with the scent of mildew and something metallic, billowed out. At the bottom, a narrow, unlit corridor stretched into the gloom. This was an underground bunker. The air was heavy, still, as if time itself had slowed to a crawl in this subterranean space. The bunker was surprisingly large, a series of crude chambers carved directly into the rock. Shelves lined the walls, laden with forgotten tools, sealed glass jars containing unidentifiable specimens, and stacks of yellowed papers. Dust motes danced in the flashlight's beam, disturbed by his breath. Dean moved slowly, his boots crunching on loose gravel, a sense of profound unease settling over him. In the deepest chamber, tucked away on a rickety wooden desk beneath a layer of dust so thick it resembled felt, he found it. A journal. Its leather cover was cracked and warped, stained by what looked like seawater, the pages swollen and brittle. He picked it up, the weight of it surprisingly heavy in his hand. Back in the relative light of his kitchen, he carefully opened the journal. The handwriting was his grandfather's, a familiar, spidery scrawl, but the contents were anything but. The initial entries were mundane, observations on weather patterns and lighthouse maintenance, but as he turned the fragile pages, the script grew more frantic, the margins filled with crude, disturbing sketches. Tentacled forms writhed across the paper, monstrous, eyeless creatures with too many limbs, their bodies depicted with an unsettling fluidity that implied movement beneath immense pressure. There were swirling, hypnotic patterns that seemed to draw the eye inward, and distorted, elongated figures that were almost, but not quite, human. Then came the words, scrawled in thick, desperate strokes, the deep song, he read aloud, his voice sounding thin and reedy in the silent room. It calls. The pact awakens. He tried to rationalize it, of course. His grandfather had been a recluse, alone on this island for decades. Isolation could do strange things to a mind. Perhaps these were merely the fevered imaginings of a lonely old man, his artistic outlet for cabin fever. The sketches were certainly unsettling, but perhaps he'd been inspired by strange rock formations, or distorted visions of deep-sea life. He, a cartographer, understood the power of the unknown to spark the imagination. The cottage stood sentinel on the bluff, a silhouette against the bruised sky, the lighthouse beam sweeping its lonely arc across the churning gray waves. The walk from the jetty was longer than he'd anticipated, the path overgrown and treacherous in places. When he finally reached the cottage, the air grew stiller, the wind momentarily hushed. The padlock on the heavy oak door was rusted solid. With a grunt of effort, he managed to force it open, the screech of metal echoing unnervingly. The air hung heavy, smelling of salt, old paper, and something indefinable, like forgotten dreams. His grandfather's presence, though long gone, seemed to linger in the settled grime. Dean dropped his duffel bag in the main room, the thud resonating in the quiet. He was tired, but a restless energy buzzed beneath his skin, a determination to peel back the layers of this place, to understand what had drawn his grandfather here, and what, precisely, he had left behind. He spent the rest of the evening methodically cleaning, wiping away decades of neglect. He discovered a small, heavy oak chest tucked beneath a loose floorboard in the study, a space that smelled particularly of ink and old parchment. Inside, nestled amongst brittle maps and faded photographs, was his grandfather's journal. It was bound in worn leather, its pages filled with a sprawling, increasingly frantic hand. The earlier entries were legible, detailing weather patterns, shipping routes, and the mundane life of a lighthouse keeper. But as Dean turned the pages, the tone shifted, the observations becoming more abstract, more unsettling. The old ones speak of a city, one entry read, dated years ago. Not Atlantis, not some fanciful myth. He remembered fleeting mentions in his grandfather's sparse letters of island lore, but he dismissed them as the ramblings of a solitary man. Now, reading these words, a prickle of unease traced its way up his spine. Another entry, later still of the pact. They spoke of a pact. A bargain made, generations ago, to keep the deep slumbering. But what was given? What was taken? The island remembers, even if the keepers forget. The words were disjointed, almost feverish. A pact? What kind of pact? And with whom? He found a hidden door in the back of the property, concealed by overgrown ivy and a cleverly disguised stone slab. It led down a steep, narrow flight of steps into an underground bunker. Shelves lined the walls, filled with books on local history, maritime folklore, and strange, archaic texts in languages Dean couldn't identify. The pact, the sunken city, the forgotten rites, it all began to coalesce into a disturbing narrative. Dean felt a strange pull, a sense that he was not merely reading history, but unearthing something live and breathing, something that had been patiently waiting. That night, sleep offered no respite. He was submerged, not drowning, but being water, part of an unimaginable depth. Shapes shifted in the periphery, colossal and indistinct, like mountains moving in slow motion. It wasn't a human sound, nor an animal one. The pressure mounted, his chest ached, and he tasted salt, thick and briny, on his tongue. He woke with a gasp, his heart hammering against his ribs, the dream still clinging to him like a shroud. The thrumming seemed to echo in his ears. He sat up, disoriented, the small room swallowed by the pre-dawn gloom. The air was heavy, damp. He swung his legs out of bed, his bare feet meeting the cold floorboards. As he stood, a faint, ethereal glow caught his eye. On the wooden bedside table, where he'd left a half-empty glass of water, a shimmering, phosphorescent green light pulsed. It wasn't coming from the water itself, but from the surface of the wood, spreading in intricate, branching patterns, like veins. Bioluminescent algae. He stared, transfixed, his mind struggling to process the impossible. How? He hadn't brought any here. He hadn't been near the sea in hours. The patterns seemed to pulse with a slow, deliberate rhythm, mirroring the thrumming he'd heard in his dream. He reached out a trembling finger, almost afraid to touch it. The light recoiled slightly, then pulsed again, brighter this time, a silent, living thing growing in his isolated cottage, miles from the deep, yet undeniably born of it. The island was not merely holding secrets, it was actively reaching out. The strange pull Dean felt, a magnetic dread that had begun in the pages of his grandfather's journal and the unsettling tome, now pulsed with a new, insistent rhythm within the cottage itself. He found himself staring at the old brass compass on the mantelpiece, a family heirloom, its needle quivering erratically, no longer pointing north but spinning in slow, aimless circles. A faint, almost imperceptible hum began to permeate the air, a low thrumming that seemed to vibrate in his teeth more than his ears, growing steadily in intensity. It was like the deep, resonant drone of a distant foghorn, but without the comforting knowledge of its source or purpose. He tried to ignore it, to rationalize it as an old house settling, the wind playing tricks through loose panes. He paced the small living room, the floorboards creaking under his boots, the rhythmic sound of his own footsteps a desperate attempt to drown out the insidious hum. He picked up a chipped porcelain mug from the kitchen counter, still warm from his tea, and placed it down with a deliberate clatter. Moments later, he watched, frozen, as the mug slowly, almost imperceptibly, slid an inch across the smooth wood, leaving a faint wet ring. His breath hitched. He reached out, his fingers brushing the cool ceramic, and pushed it back into place. He told himself it was the vibration from the hum, a structural tremor. But the hum had no discernible source, and the mug had moved with an unnatural, deliberate slowness. It pressed against his eardrums, blurring the edges of his thoughts, making him feel disoriented. He walked into the small bathroom, splashed cold water on his face, and looked up into the mirror. For a terrifying instant, his reflection wavered. The lines of his face softened, then stretched, his eyes seeming to widen and deepen, taking on an unnatural, inky blackness. The skin around his mouth seemed to ripple, as if seen through disturbed water. He blinked hard, rubbing his eyes, and when he looked again, his own tired, strained face stared back. It was gone. Just a trick of the light, he told himself, the lack of sleep, the stress. But the image lingered, a cold dread coiling in his stomach. He wasn't just seeing things, something was showing them to him. The incident with the mirror shattered his last vestiges of rationalization. The entity, whatever it was no longer content with subtle hints and ancient texts. It was here, in the cottage, in the very air he breathed. He remembered a recurring symbol in the journal, a jagged trident-like mark, often scrawled next to mentions of a hidden chamber or the lowest point. Driven by a grim resolve, Dean grabbed a heavy-duty flashlight and the old cottage keys, one of which was larger, heavier, and intricately carved. His grandfather's journal had contained a cryptic diagram, a rough sketch of the cottage's foundations pointing to a discreet access panel hidden beneath the floorboards of the pantry. This was it, the underground bunker. The air grew heavier, thicker, the hum now a palpable pressure against his chest. Water dripped somewhere unseen, echoing unnervingly. The bunker was small, circular, perhaps 20 feet in diameter. Around it, the floor was covered in a thick layer of dried, flaky residue, not dust, but something organic, like desiccated seaweed mixed with fine, gritty sand. His flashlight beam swept across the walls, revealing countless etched symbols, crude and ancient, identical to the jagged trident-like mark from his grandfather's journal. They were layered over each other, some faint, others freshly carved, as if repeatedly renewed. He shivered, a visceral revulsion rising in his throat. This wasn't just a place of study, it was a sanctuary, a site of ritual. It was his grandfather's hand, detailing not observations. Incantations, please. His grandfather wasn't just researching, he was actively engaged in a desperate, horrifying pact. A sudden, sharp crack echoed from above, followed by a low, slithering sound. He fumbled for his lighter, his fingers clumsy with fear. Then, he felt it. He heard a distinct, sucking sound, like something being dragged across a slick surface. The lighter finally caught, a tiny, flickering flame illuminating the terrifying truth. It pulsed with a malevolent, silent energy, stretching towards him. The air grew heavy with the smell of brine and decay, a stench that pierced his very being. He leaned against the pantry wall, gasping for air, his body trembling uncontrollably. He knelt, tracing the rough diagram in his grandfather's journal with a finger that felt oddly numb. The sketch pointed to a section of the main living area, near the hearth, where the flagstones were particularly worn. He dragged aside a braided rug, revealing the uneven stone floor beneath. One flagstone, slightly larger than the rest, had a hairline crack running along its edge. He pressed, pushed, tested. It didn't budge. He remembered a detail from the journal, a faint scratch near the hearthstone, resembling an arrow. Following its silent instruction, he found a small, almost invisible indentation, a fingerhold disguised as a natural imperfection in the stone. He wedged his fingers into the gap, pulling with all his might. A grating sigh of ancient mortar, a whisper of disturbed dust, and the flagstone slowly, reluctantly, lifted. Beneath it, a square opening plunged into absolute darkness. It was a smell that prickled the back of his throat, raising the fine hairs on his arms. He aimed the flashlight down the shaft. The sound of the waves, usually a distant murmur, seemed to intensify, morphing into a low, resonant thrum that vibrated through the very soles of his worn boots. The deep song was closer here, more insistent. Taking a deep, unsteady breath, Dean descended. The air grew heavier, pressing in on him, making his ears ache. The thrumming intensified, a deep, guttural note that seemed to originate not from the sea, but from the very bedrock of the island. He felt a strange disquiet, a loosening of his grip on the immediate present. Was the air thinning? Or was his mind simply beginning to fray? The steps finally ended in a narrow, arched doorway, cut directly into the rock. The flashlight beam revealed a low-ceilinged chamber, rough-hewn and primitive, yet clearly engineered. This was it, the underground bunker. The air hung thick and heavy, stagnant for decades. In the center of the bunker stood a roughly carved stone pedestal, and upon it, a thick, leather-bound book, not his grandfather's personal journal, but an older, larger tome. Dean approached, his movements sluggish, as if wading through thick water. He opened the older book, its pages brittle and yellowed, filled with his grandfather's familiar, precise script, but interspersed with strange symbols and crude, disturbing drawings. He flipped through, the deep song now a cacophony in his mind, making it hard to focus. He saw diagrams of the island, marked with specific points, lines connecting them to the deep ocean. There were repeated references to the pact and the warding. Then, a specific entry caught his eye, written in a hand that seemed more frantic, the ink smudged as if by a trembling hand. The cycles shorten. The hunger grows. It demands its due. I perform the rites, but the strength wanes. The song. It calls for me. It calls for us. Dean's breath hitched. Rites? His grandfather wasn't just observing. He was performing something. He wasn't a passive guardian, but an active participant in a grim, desperate ritual. Another entry, scrawled across a page filled with swirling, tentacle-like patterns, the blood. It must be fresh. The wards hold, but barely. The cost. The cost is too great, but what choice? Blood? What kind of ritual involved blood, and whose blood? The deep song swelled, a wave of pure, crushing sound that slammed into his skull. He swayed, clutching the book, the words blurring before his eyes. He felt a profound sense of disorientation, a terrifying slippage of reality. Was the air thick with something more than moisture? He could almost taste it, a briny, metallic tang on his tongue that wasn't from the air, but from his own imagination. He rubbed his temples, a dull ache throbbing behind his eyes. The intricately carved key in his pocket felt suddenly heavy, not just with metal, but with the weight of a terrible inheritance. The deep song was no longer just a sound, it was a promise, a threat, and a beckoning. And it was singing directly to him. The deep song howled in Dean's head, a discordant symphony of grinding stone and abyssal lament that threatened to splinter his very skull. The ancient tome, still clutched in his numb fingers, felt impossibly heavy. He swayed, the flickering lamplight in the underground bunker mocking his reeling senses, making the rough-hewn walls appear to ripple like disturbed water. Blood. The word echoed in his mind, sharp and cold amidst the cacophony. A ritual. A pact. He pushed the thought away, forcing his gaze back to the section of wall he'd noticed earlier, a faint seam, barely visible beneath layers of grime and salt spray residue. He had to see. This was no longer about a fresh start, no longer about escaping grief. This was about survival, about understanding the malignant force that had taken root beneath the island and was now reaching for him. He dropped the book onto a nearby crate, the thud swallowed by the pervasive drone. With a deep, shuddering breath, he approached the wall. The seam was more pronounced up close, a faint hairline fracture in the stone that suggested a hidden door, cunningly disguised. He ran his fingers along it, feeling the rough, damp rock, tasting the metallic tang of the air that seemed to intensify here. Searching for a latch or handle, his fingers brushed against a small, almost invisible indentation. He pressed. A low, grinding groan, far older than any human machinery, shuddered through the very foundations of the bunker. Dust, thick and choking, rained down from the ceiling. The seam widened, slowly, agonizingly, revealing not a door, but a dense, obsidian-like slab of rock that began to retract into the wall with a terrible, resonant scrape. Dean stumbled back, coughing, his eyes wide. The slab receded fully, revealing a narrow, vertical slit that bled an unearthly, phosphorescent glow. He peered into the opening. The passage beyond was short, perhaps only a few feet, before opening into a larger space. The chamber was small, circular, and utterly unlike anything he had ever seen. The walls here were not carved, but seemed to be grown, a seamless, chitinous surface that pulsed with that same eerie, internal light. It was a faint, sickly green, like bioluminescent algae at impossible depths. The air was heavy, viscous, pressing in on him from all sides. It was not an artifact in any sense he understood. It pulsed. Not just with light, but with a slow, deliberate rhythm, like an immense, alien heart. Each pulse sent a ripple of sickly green luminescence through its knotted surface, illuminating fleeting glimpses of impossible geometry, of forms that twisted and reformed in the periphery of his vision. This was the source. This was the true engine. As Dean stared, mesmerized and horrified, the pulsating mass seemed to reach for him, not with physical tendrils, but with an unseen force that tugged at his mind. The deep song intensified, becoming an overwhelming torrent of sound and sensation, and then, without warning, it broke. His vision exploded. The small chamber vanished, replaced by a terrifying, immersive hallucination. He saw the island, but it was not the island he knew. It was dissolving, its granite cliffs crumbling into the churning, black ocean, its lighthouse toppling into the depths like a discarded toy. The lighthouse, his sanctuary, was gone, swallowed by the rising tides of oblivion. He thrashed, desperate to break free, to claw his way back to the meager reality of the underground bunker. The alien heart continued its slow, rhythmic thrum, casting its sickly green light on his trembling form. The vision had receded, but its imprint remained, burned into his terrified mind. This was not just an entity stirring, it was actively reaching, actively consuming. The pact, the blood, the song, it was all part of an encroaching tide, and he was standing directly in its path. The island was its staging ground, and Dean, the unwitting inheritor, was its next intended vessel. He swayed, the flickering lamplight in the underground bunker mocking his reeling senses, painting long, distorted shadows that seemed to writhe with a life of their own. It wasn't just a sound anymore. He felt tendrils, not of flesh, but of raw, ancient hunger, probing at the edges of his awareness, searching for a seam, a crack to widen. His teeth chattered, a frantic rhythm against the rising tide of the entity's influence. No, he rasped, the word a thin, reedy protest against the crushing tide. He saw things behind his eyelids, swirling blackness, phosphorescent motes like distant, dying stars, and then, a vast, unblinking eye, too large, too ancient to comprehend, staring back from an impossible distance. It wasn't merely observing, it was reaching. He stumbled, his knee hitting the rough concrete floor of the underground bunker with a jarring thud. Pain, sharp and immediate, momentarily cut through the mental assault, a welcome anchor in the storm. He opened his eyes, blinking furiously, trying to clear the encroaching fog from his vision. The bunker walls, usually a comforting if grim enclosure, now felt like the throat of some monstrous beast, slowly constricting around him. The air grew thick, heavy with the scent of damp earth and something else, something saline and rotten, like kelp left to fester on a forgotten shore. This wasn't just a distant echo of a threat, it was a direct assault. The entity wasn't merely stirring, it was actively trying to break through, to possess him, to use him as a conduit, or perhaps, simply to devour his sanity. He couldn't just stand there and let it happen. He wouldn't. Not after everything. His gaze fell back to the tome, its leather binding cracked and worn, its pages brittle. This was his only hope. His grandfather, for all his madness, had left these warnings, these fragments of forgotten knowledge. The ancient script, which before had seemed merely archaic, now felt alive, squirming under his gaze, the ink itself seeming to deepen and shift. He scanned frantically, his eyes darting across diagrams that looked like constellations twisted into grotesque patterns, and glyphs that pulsed with a faint, inner light in his peripheral vision. His mind, still under siege from the deep song, struggled to grasp the meaning, each sentence a battle against the rising tide of abstraction. He muttered to himself, words spilling out in a frantic stream, trying to parse the archaic language, to connect the fragmented pieces of lore. The veil. The breach. The binding. He flipped past pages describing the entity's awakening, its hunger, its slow creep into reality. He needed a solution, not a history lesson. Then, a section, marked with a blood-red stain that had long since dried to a rusty brown, caught his eye. The script here was denser, more intricate, almost a cipher in itself. He traced the words with a grimy fingertip, slowly, painstakingly, pulling meaning from the swirling chaos. Not of blood, nor of bone, but of self. A living sacrifice, not for death, but for eternal vigil. To become the keeper, not of light, but of the unlight. Dean's breath hitched. A living sacrifice. Not to die, but to become an eternal guardian, bound to the very thing he sought to seal away. To become the lock, to become the keeper of the unlight. It meant severing himself from the world, from everything he was, from everything he ever knew. This wasn't just a ritual, it was a damnation. His grandfather hadn't just been a keeper of the light, he had been hinting at a far more terrible duty. He looked around the underground bunker, at the damp concrete, the crude shelves, the solitary lamp. This was where it would happen. This was the crucible. He was trapped. The entity was at his door, clawing at the fragile membrane of his sanity. And the only key, the only hope, was to sacrifice the very essence of himself. He was scared, more terrified than he had ever been in his life, but beneath the fear, a grim resolve began to harden. He had come here seeking solitude, seeking a fresh start after tragedy. The ritual was incomplete, missing key components, but the core demand was clear. A living sacrifice. The words echoed in Dean's skull, not a thought, but a resonant hum, a vibration that threatened to dislodge something vital within him. Not death, no. That would have been a mercy, a finality he could comprehend. This was something far more insidious, an eternal tethering, a monstrous fusion. To become a sentinel, a guardian, bound to the very thing he sought to repel. He would not die, he would become. The implication clawed at him, a cold, wet tendril reaching into the core of his identity. Outside, the island groaned. The wind, which had been a constant companion, now shrieked with a sound that felt less like air moving and more like a tortured vocalization. It tore at the cottage's foundations, rattling the windows with a furious, relentless assault. Dean stumbled to the small, grimy pane, peering out into a world utterly consumed by chaos. The fog, a familiar shroud, had curdled into something thick and oily, swirling in impossible eddies, tinged with a sickly, phosphorescent green. It wasn't just mist, it was a living, breathing entity, pressing against the glass, distorting the world beyond into a nightmare of shifting forms. He could barely make out the distant, jagged coastline. The waves, once merely powerful, now slammed against the cliffs with a sound like titanic hammers, each impact vibrating through the very bedrock of the island. Spray, not just salt water but a viscous, almost gelatinous substance, lashed against the rocks, clinging to them like some monstrous, translucent slime. Dean watched, horrified, as a section of the cliff face, weathered and ancient, seemed to shift, the granite groaning under an unseen pressure. Barnacles, impossibly large and glistening, had erupted from the stone, forming grotesque clusters that pulsed faintly in the unnatural light. The very ground seemed to be dissolving, losing its terrestrial integrity, softening, becoming pliable under the entity's burgeoning will. A profound, sickening smell seeped into the cottage, even through the sealed windows, the scent of brine mixed with something profoundly rotten, a decay that spoke not of death, but of a life perverted, twisted. It was the smell of the deep, but a deep that had festered, grown malignant. The journal, open to its final, cryptic pages, was his only guide. The counter-ritual, a desperate gamble, required specific conditions, a precise location. The underground bunker. His grandfather's scrawled notes indicated it was the only place fortified enough, isolated enough, to attempt to contain the encroaching malevolence. With a heavy, determined breath, Dean snatched up the journal, tucking it into his oilskin coat. He grabbed the heavy brass lantern, its flame a tiny, defiant spark against the encroaching gloom. The cottage door, usually a stubborn piece of oak, felt like a flimsy shield as he wrestled it open. The moment he stepped outside, the wind tore at him, a physical force that sought to rip him from his feet. He fought his way across the uneven ground, the path to the bunker a treacherous gauntlet. What had been familiar rocks now seemed to writhe, their surfaces slick with the viscous spray, reflecting the sickly green light. He saw kelp, torn from the shore by the violent waves, lying in strange, almost deliberate patterns on the sand, forming symbols he couldn't quite decipher, but which felt imbued with an ancient, malevolent purpose. One gnarled piece of driftwood, half buried in the sand, pulsed with the same faint luminescence as the barnacles on the cliff. It was as if the entity was reaching, grasping, asserting its dominion over every particle of the island. Finally, battered and gasping, he reached the entrance to the underground bunker. A heavy, rusted iron hatch lay half buried in the overgrown earth, its hinges screaming in protest as he forced it open. A gust of wind howled into the opening, carrying with it the sickening smell, now intensified, almost suffocating. Inside, the bunker was a single, circular chamber, surprisingly spacious. A rough stone slab occupied the center, presumably an altar or work surface. Dean pulled out the journal, its pages illuminated by the trembling light of the lantern. His grandfather's final entry was stark, uncompromising. It detailed the components needed for the ritual, a specific configuration of ancient symbols, etched into the stone, a precise arrangement of certain sea-grown minerals, gleaned from the deepest tidal pools, and finally, the binding of the living essence. His eyes were wide, haunted, but also alight with a desperate resolve. He understood now. The counter-ritual wouldn't destroy the entity. It would merely imprison it, seal it away once more. And the cost of that sealing, the lock on the cage, would be him. His life, yes, but not in death. In eternal servitude, his consciousness woven into the very fabric of the binding, a perpetual anchor. He would cease to be Dean, the cartographer, and become something else entirely. The island screamed. He gripped the journal, his knuckles white. This was it. The final stand. The ultimate sacrifice. He was ready. The words, a living sacrifice, had burned themselves into Dean's mind, not as a coherent thought, but as a brand of ice and fire. His grandfather's journal, its leather cover now cool and dry, no longer pulsed with that unsettling light, but its weight in his hand felt immense, a leaden anchor to a terrible truth. He had seen the final, cryptic entry, understood the chilling implication. There was no escaping it, no other path. His determination was a cold, brittle thing, honed by grief and the relentless pressure of the island's whispers. He moved through the fog-choked night, the lighthouse beam sweeping its mournful arc overhead, briefly illuminating the treacherous path. The air was thick with the smell of salt and damp earth, the unseen ocean a constant, hungry roar. Each step towards the underground bunker was a conscious act of will, a forced march against the primal urge to flee. The journal's instructions were precise, horrifyingly so, detailing the ancient symbols, the necessary implements, and the ultimate price. The entrance to the underground bunker was a slab of rusted metal, half hidden by overgrown gorse. It groaned open with a sound like a tortured beast, revealing a gaping maw of blackness. The beam of his flashlight cut through the gloom, revealing walls slick with condensation, adorned with crude, unsettling etchings, spirals and jagged lines that seemed to writhe in the periphery of his vision. Finally, the passage opened into a vast, circular chamber. Here, the air was different, thick, and vibrating with an unseen energy. A low, resonant thrum filled the space, a sound that seemed to originate not from the air, but from within his own bones. In the center of the chamber, a circular indentation, ringed with more of those unsettling symbols, glowed with a faint, internal luminescence. This was the portal, the aperture through which the entity bled into their reality. Dean felt it then, the full, crushing weight of its presence. It wasn't a physical form yet, not entirely, but a pervasive, suffocating intelligence that pressed in from all sides. He felt his memories flicker, distorting like old film reels. The image of his lost loved one, once a source of comfort, now twisted into a grotesque, accusing visage. "You brought this here. He staggered, gripping the journal tighter, its pages now feeling impossibly heavy. He remembered the final passage in his grandfather's scrawl, "Only the willing heart, severed from its anchor, can mend the tear." Dean swallowed, tasting brine and fear. He moved to the edge of the glowing circle, setting down the journal. His hands, trembling, began to arrange the ritual components he'd gathered from the cottage: small, etched stones, a bowl of sea salt, a tarnished silver knife. Each movement was deliberate, a desperate defiance against the mental chaos. As he worked, the entity's attacks intensified. The air grew frigid, biting at his exposed skin. "You cannot resist. You are already ours." He pushed himself up, his muscles screaming. The final, terrible step. The living sacrifice wasn't about another life, but his own, a severing of the most profound connection he possessed. He remembered the last time he'd seen his loved one, the way their hand had felt in his, the warmth of their smile. These memories, once cherished, were now the entity's weapons, twisted into images of pain and loss, each one designed to break him, to make him surrender. With a ragged cry, Dean raised the silver knife. It required him to cut away the deepest anchor of his grief, the connection to his past, the very memory that had defined his existence since the tragedy. This was the true living sacrifice, not his blood, but the core of his being, the part of him that still clung to the ghost of what was. He pressed the blade against his palm, not for the blood, but for the symbolic act. As the sharp edge bit into his flesh, a searing pain, both physical and psychic, lanced through him. And with a strength born of utter desperation, Dean pushed. He pushed away the images, the emotions, the love, the grief, everything that tied him to that profound loss, sacrificing the very essence of his sorrow to fuel the binding. A guttural roar tore through the underground bunker, not from the entity, but from the portal itself, a sound of agony and rejection. The glowing circle pulsed violently, then began to shrink, contracting inwards. The entity was gone, or at least, contained. But so too, was a part of Dean, a part he could never reclaim. The price had been paid. He pushed himself up, his muscles screaming, each fiber protesting the exhaustion that had settled deep in his bones. The very air vibrated with the deep song, a guttural hum that had intensified with every passing hour, a relentless thrum against his eardrums and his very soul. The final, terrible step. He remembered the last time he'd seen his loved one, the way their hand had felt in his, warm and alive. The path to the underground bunker was a descent into the island's cold, wet maw. Each breath he took felt like swallowing silt. The deep song here was no longer a hum but a cacophony, 1,000 voices whispering from the abyssal depths, a promise of oblivion. His grandfather's work, he knew. Or perhaps, the work of those who came before him. The bunker itself was a circular chamber, vast and echoing, its ceiling lost in the gloom. Around it, a complex array of symbols had been painted in a substance that glowed faintly, a sickly phosphorescence that pulsed with the deep song's rhythm. He recognized some of the sigils from his grandfather's journals, symbols of binding and warding, but others were alien, predatory. This wasn't merely a place of containment, it was a cage, and the ritual was its lock. On the altar, a small, obsidian knife lay beside a shallow bowl filled with an unidentifiable, viscous liquid. Dean knew what he had to do. He approached the altar, his boots crunching on something gritty on the floor. He picked up the knife, it was unnervingly heavy, its edge impossibly keen. The deep song swelled, pressing against his skull, threatening to burst it. He closed his eyes, forcing himself to focus, to reach for that one pure, untainted memory. His loved one's hand, their laugh, the way their eyes crinkled at the corners. Then, with a shuddering breath, he sliced his palm. Blood welled, thick and crimson, dripping into the bowl. He knew this wasn't enough. The physical act was merely a conduit. The true sacrifice had to come from within. He held his bleeding hand over the bowl, his mind reaching for the memory, for the image of his loved one. He saw them, clear as day, smiling, laughing, their hand reaching for his. And then, with a conscious, agonizing effort of will, he twisted the image. He forced it to curdle, to warp. A profound, guttural sigh seemed to emanate from the very stone walls, a sound of immense satisfaction and slow retreat. The deep song didn't vanish, but it receded, becoming a distant drone, a faint thrum beneath the island, no longer clawing at his mind. He felt utterly drained, not just physically, but spiritually. The connection was severed. The memory, once a source of comfort, was now a fractured, painful thing, a wound that would never truly heal. He slumped against the cold stone, the obsidian knife clattering to the floor. The immediate threat was neutralized, yes, but at a cost that felt worse than death. He had sacrificed the last piece of his former self, the purest part of his connection to the world he had lost. He was no longer just Dean, the reclusive cartographer. He was something else now, a vessel scarred by the deep song, a mind etched with the knowledge of what lay beneath. He dragged himself out of the underground bunker, up the winding steps, each movement an effort. The dawn was breaking, painting the sky in bruised purples and grays, but the light felt alien, harsh. He reached the lighthouse, his cottage, and looked out at the churning sea. The fog was lifting, revealing the endless expanse of gray water. He saw no monsters, no tentacles, no immediate signs of the entity. But he knew it was there, dormant, waiting, and he carried its imprint within him. The deep song was a faint, incessant whisper in the back of his thoughts, a lullaby of the void. He was free, perhaps, but freedom had come at the price of his very soul. He was bound to this island, not by chains, but by knowledge, by the terrible understanding of what slept beneath the waves, and the haunting echo of a memory he had willingly, desperately, corrupted to save himself. He stared at the horizon, a man adrift in his own skin, an unwilling guardian of a peace he could no longer truly feel. The future was an uncharted map, and he, the cartographer, was lost.